Before the mountains rose from the earth, before the seas found their boundaries, before the first star was named by human lips, there existed a world so extraordinary that its memory has been nearly erased from human consciousness. A civilization so advanced, so magnificent, yet so utterly lost that most dismiss it as mere legend. Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your bed, let me take you on a journey to the most mysterious chapter in human history. A time when giants walked among mortals, when knowledge flowed like rivers from celestial beings, and when the very fabric of reality operated under different laws. This is the story of the antediluvian world, the forgotten age before the flood. Close your eyes and imagine a time when a single generation could witness centuries unfold, when the lifespan of a man stretched nearly 1,000 years, and when the boundary between the divine and mortal realms was as thin as morning mist. This wasn't the primitive Stone Age world your history books might suggest. This was something far more extraordinary, a golden age of human civilization that achieved wonders we can barely comprehend today. The very word antediluvian carries within it the weight of an entire lost epoch. Derived from Latin, meaning before the deluge, it speaks of a time that ended not with the slow decay of empires or the march of conquering armies, but with water. Unimaginable torrents of water that swept away not just cities and peoples, but nearly every trace of what came before. You might wonder how we know anything about this lost world at all. The answer lies buried in the most ancient texts of human civilization, tablets of baked clay inscribed with wedge-shaped marks, scrolls preserved in desert caves, and oral traditions passed down through countless generations like whispered secrets in the dark. The oldest of these records comes to us from ancient Mesopotamia, from the people we call the Sumerians. These master scribes, working with reeds pressed into wet clay over 4,000 years ago, preserved something remarkable: the Sumerian King List. This isn't just any chronicle of rulers. It's a document that divides all of human history into two distinct periods, before the Great Flood and after. What makes this ancient text so extraordinary isn't just its age, but what it reveals about the world that came before. The pre-flood kings, according to these meticulous records, didn't rule for decades like modern leaders. They ruled for thousands of years. The tablet speaks matter-of-factly of kings whose reigns lasted 28,800 years, 36,000 years, even 43,200 years. These aren't poetic exaggerations or symbolic numbers. They're presented as historical fact by civilizations that were masters of mathematics and astronomy. The Sumerian scribes weren't alone in preserving these memories. From the ziggurats of Babylon to the temples of Egypt, from the oral traditions of Native American tribes to the ancient epics of India, cultures across the globe have maintained remarkably similar accounts of this lost golden age. They speak of a time when the gods walked openly among humans, when knowledge was freely shared between heaven and earth, and when the very nature of existence was fundamentally different from our own. But perhaps the most detailed account of this vanished world comes to us through the biblical narrative of Genesis. Here, in the familiar story of Adam and Eve, of Cain and Abel, of the long genealogies with their impossible lifespans, we find not just spiritual allegory, but potential historical memory. The Bible tells us that Adam lived 930 years, that Methuselah reached 969 years, that Noah himself was 600 years old when the flood began. Think about what such lifespans would mean for human civilization. In our modern world, a brilliant inventor or scientist might have 30 or 40 productive years to develop their ideas. But imagine if that same mind had 3, 4, or even 5 centuries to refine their knowledge, to collaborate with other long-lived individuals, to build upon discoveries across multiple generations of normal human experience. The biblical account gives us tantalizing glimpses of just such advancement. It tells us that by the 7th generation from Adam, humans had already built cities, developed advanced metallurgy, created musical instruments, and established complex agricultural systems. Tubal-Cain, we're told, was an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. This is remarkable because archaeological evidence suggests that ironworking didn't become common in the ancient Near East until after 1200 BC. Yet, if we follow biblical chronology, Tubal-Cain would have lived thousands of years earlier. This discrepancy has puzzled scholars for generations. How could ancient texts describe advanced metallurgy existing so far before the archaeological record suggests it was possible? The answer may lie in understanding that what we consider the dawn of civilization might actually be humanity slowly rebuilding after a catastrophic collapse, picking up fragments of knowledge from a much more advanced world that came before. The physical evidence for this lost civilization remains tantalizingly elusive, and for good reason. If a global catastrophe of the magnitude described in flood traditions actually occurred, we wouldn't expect to find much surface evidence of what came before. Hundreds of feet of flood sediment would have buried the antediluvian world beneath layers of mud and debris. The few traces that might survive would be the most durable constructions, massive stone monuments that could withstand both flood and time. And indeed, when we look at some of the world's most ancient and mysterious structures, we find architecture that seems to defy the technological capabilities attributed to their supposed builders. The Great Pyramid of Giza, with its precise astronomical alignments and impossible tolerances. The megalithic walls of Sacsayhuamán in Peru, where stones weighing hundreds of tons fit together so perfectly that not even a knife blade can slip between them. The underwater ruins off the coast of Japan at Yonaguni, carved from bedrock in patterns that suggest human design yet lie beneath waters that have been submerged for over 12,000 years. Could these monuments be remnants of the antediluvian world? Structures so massive and precisely built that they survived the very cataclysm that destroyed their builders. The possibility is both thrilling and sobering thrilling because it suggests our ancestors achieved far more than we've imagined, and sobering because it reminds us that even the greatest civilizations can be lost to time and catastrophe. The antediluvian world wasn't just advanced in technology. It was a realm where the supernatural and natural intersected in ways that modern minds struggle to comprehend. Ancient texts speak of beings called the Nephilim, often translated as giants, but carrying the deeper meaning of the fallen ones. These weren't merely tall humans, they were described as beings of extraordinary size and strength, warriors and rulers, who dominated the antediluvian landscape. The book of Genesis tells us that there were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. This cryptic passage has sparked countless theories and debates, but one thing remains clear. The pre-flood world was populated by beings that differed dramatically from ordinary humans. Archaeological reports from the 19th and early 20th centuries describe the discovery of human remains of extraordinary size skeletons measuring 8, 10, even 12 feet in height, often found alongside sophisticated tools and weapons. Many of these discoveries were allegedly collected by museums, particularly the Smithsonian Institution, only to mysteriously disappear from public records. Whether these accounts represent genuine archaeological finds or exaggerated folklore, they reflect a persistent human memory of a time when giants walked the earth. The source of these giants, according to ancient texts, lay in the forbidden union between heavenly beings and earthly women. The Book of Enoch, an ancient Jewish text that was highly regarded in the early centuries of Christianity, provides an elaborate account of 200 angels called Watchers who descended to earth and took human wives. These fallen angels didn't just intermarry with humans, they taught them forbidden knowledge. According to Enochian tradition, the Watchers revealed to humanity the secrets of metallurgy, astronomy, cosmetics, weaponry, and magic. They taught the making of swords and shields, the reading of celestial signs, the preparation of dyes and ornaments. In essence, they accelerated human technological and cultural development at a pace that natural discovery could never have achieved. But this rapid advancement came at a terrible cost. The offspring of these unions, the Nephilim giants, became increasingly violent and corrupt. The earth was filled with violence and bloodshed, as these hybrid by the Watchers was turned beings used their superior size and strength to dominate and oppress ordinary humans. The knowledge given to destructive purposes, creating weapons of unprecedented lethality and establishing systems of oppression that spread across the antediluvian world. The biblical account tells us that by the time of Noah, the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. This wasn't simply moral decay, it was a fundamental corruption of human nature itself, brought about by the mingling of divine and mortal bloodlines and the misuse of forbidden knowledge. As you drift towards sleep tonight, imagine trying to comprehend a world where the very laws of physics seemed more flexible, where beings of immense power walked openly among humans, and where knowledge flowed from sources beyond earthly experience. Picture cities that dwarfed anything we've built, technologies that harnessed forces we're only beginning to understand, and lifespans that stretched across centuries of accumulated wisdom and experience. This was the antediluvian world, a realm of wonders and terrors, of divine knowledge and human ambition, of golden achievements and darkening shadows. It was a civilization that rose to heights we can barely imagine, only to fall so completely that its very existence has become the stuff of legend and myth. But the story doesn't end with destruction. Tomorrow, we'll explore how this lost world met its end in the greatest catastrophe in human history, and how fragments of its knowledge, its bloodlines, and its mysteries survived the flood to shape our modern world in ways we're only beginning to understand. The flood came not as a gentle rain or a rising river, but as something far more terrifying, a complete unraveling of the natural order itself. Ancient texts describe it not merely as water falling from the sky, but as the very foundations of the earth breaking apart, as the fountains of the great deep burst forth while the windows of heaven opened simultaneously. Picture, if you can, a world where the climate itself was fundamentally different from our own. Many scholars believe the antediluvian earth existed under what's called a vapor canopy, a layer of water suspended in the upper atmosphere that created a greenhouse effect across the entire planet. This canopy would have filtered harmful radiation, maintained consistent temperatures from pole to pole, and created atmospheric pressure conditions that could support much larger life forms than we see today. Under such conditions, the human body itself might have functioned differently. Higher atmospheric pressure could have allowed more efficient oxygen absorption, potentially explaining the extraordinary lifespans recorded in ancient texts. The absence of harmful radiation might have prevented the cellular damage that leads to aging as we know it. In this environment, a human being could theoretically live for centuries while maintaining physical vigor and mental acuity far beyond what we consider possible. But this perfect world carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. The same vapor canopy that sustained life for nearly 1,000 years would, when released, become the instrument of global annihilation. When that suspended ocean finally fell, it didn't come as ordinary rain. It came as a deluge of such magnitude that no earthly comparison exists. 40 days and nights of torrential downpour that covered even the highest mountains beneath 15 cubits of water. The geological evidence for such a catastrophe exists in layers of sediment found across the globe. In Mesopotamia, archaeologists have uncovered flood deposits several meters thick, dated to approximately 2,900 BCE. Similar flood layers appear in archaeological sites throughout the ancient Near East, suggesting that whatever caused these deposits was far more than a local river overflow. These sediment layers contain a mixture of materials that could only have been deposited by waters moving at tremendous speed across vast distances. But the flood wasn't just about water. Ancient accounts describe cosmic disturbances accompanying the deluge, the sun and moon darkening, stars falling from heaven, the Earth itself shaking and trembling. Modern catastrophist theories suggest that the flood might have been triggered by a celestial event, perhaps a close encounter with a comet or asteroid that disrupted the Earth's rotation, caused massive tectonic shifts, and destabilized the atmospheric conditions that had maintained the vapor canopy for millennia. The impact on human civilization would have been total and instantaneous. Cities that had taken centuries to build vanished beneath the waves in a matter of days. Libraries containing the accumulated knowledge of nearly 16 centuries were swept away like leaves in a hurricane. The masters of metallurgy, astronomy, and engineering, those who had learned their crafts from the watchers themselves, perished along with their secrets. Yet the flood wasn't merely destructive, it was selective. While the vast majority of antediluvian humanity perished, certain bloodlines were preserved. Noah and his family carried forward not just their lives, but their memories, their knowledge, and their genetic heritage into the post-flood world. The Bible tells us that Noah was perfect in his generations, a phrase that many interpret as meaning his lineage had remained uncontaminated by the Nephilim bloodline that had corrupted the rest of humanity. But even this salvation came with complications. Ancient texts suggest that the wives of Noah's sons may not have been as genetically pure as Noah himself. Some traditions hold that certain giant bloodlines survived the flood through these women, which would explain why the Bible records the presence of giants in the land of Canaan long after the floodwaters had receded. The survival of forbidden knowledge presents another puzzle. How did post-flood civilizations suddenly develop sophisticated astronomy, mathematics, and engineering, seemingly out of nowhere? The answer may lie in understanding that knowledge, unlike cities or artifacts, could survive a global catastrophe in human memory. 8 people carrying the accumulated wisdom of 16 centuries could, over time, selectively reintroduce that knowledge to their descendants. Consider the mysterious rapid advancement of Sumerian civilization, appearing seemingly overnight in the archaeological record with fully developed writing systems, complex mathematics, detailed astronomical knowledge, and sophisticated urban planning. Rather than representing the dawn of human civilization, Sumerian culture might actually represent the first successful attempt to rebuild civilization using preserved antediluvian knowledge. The same pattern appears across the ancient world. Egyptian pyramid-building technology that seems to emerge without precedent. Megalithic architecture in places as distant as Peru and Easter Island that requires engineering knowledge far beyond what we attribute to their builders. Ancient maps that show geographic features supposedly unknown until modern times. All of these might be echoes of antediluvian knowledge, slowly being rediscovered and applied by survivors and their descendants. Even more intriguing are the persistent legends of culture-bearing figures who appeared to various post-flood civilizations, teaching them agriculture, writing, astronomy, and law. The Sumerians spoke of the Apkallu, 7 wise beings who emerged from the sea to civilize humanity. The Egyptians revered Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing. The Mesoamericans remembered Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent who brought knowledge and culture. Could these mythological figures actually represent memories of survivors from the antediluvian world, carrying forward the wisdom of the lost age? The implications of this preserved knowledge extend far beyond ancient history. If advanced antediluvian civilizations did exist, and if fragments of their knowledge survived the flood, then our understanding of human development needs fundamental revision. We might not be the first technological civilization on Earth, but rather the latest in a cycle of rise, fall, and rebuilding that stretches back far longer than we've imagined. Archaeological anomalies begin to make more sense in this context. Tools and artifacts found in geological layers, supposedly millions of years old. Human footprints preserved alongside dinosaur tracks. Metallic objects discovered in coal seams formed long before humans were supposed to exist. Rather than dismissing these finds as hoaxes or misinterpretations, we might need to consider whether they represent traces of previous technological cycles, lost civilizations that rose and fell before our current historical timeline. The antediluvian world wasn't just destroyed, it was deliberately forgotten. As civilizations rebuilt in the aftermath of the flood, the memory of what came before became increasingly distant and mythologized. The giants became legends, the advanced technologies became attributed to gods or magic. The sophisticated knowledge systems became fragmented into mystery schools and esoteric traditions, their original context lost to time. Yet certain groups seem to have maintained more complete records of the antediluvian world. Secret societies, religious orders, and mystery traditions have preserved teachings that allegedly trace back to pre-flood sources. The Freemasons speak of antediluvian pillars containing the secrets of architecture and science. Hermetic traditions claim descent from Hermes Trismegistus, who was said to have preserved ancient wisdom through the flood. Various Gnostic texts describe a hidden knowledge that predates the current world order. Whether these claims represent genuine historical continuity or later mythological construction remains hotly debated. But the consistency of certain themes across these traditions suggests that some memory of the antediluvian world has indeed been preserved, passed down through generations of initiates who understood its significance even when the larger culture had forgotten. The genetic legacy of the antediluvian world may be even more significant than its technological or cultural heritage. If the biblical account is accurate, and if certain bloodlines from that era did survive the flood, then their descendants might still walk among us today. The extraordinary abilities attributed to antediluvian humans, extended lifespans, enhanced physical capabilities, heightened intelligence, might not be entirely extinct. Modern genetic research has identified human populations with unusual longevity, exceptional disease resistance, and remarkable physical capabilities that seem to defy normal human limitations. While scientists typically attribute these traits to environmental factors or recent genetic mutations, they might actually represent the diluted remnants of antediluvian genetic heritage, slowly being rediscovered by populations whose ancestors carried forward traces of pre-flood DNA. The implications are staggering. If we truly are the descendants of a much more advanced civilization, if our current technological development represents not progress from primitivity but recovery from catastrophic loss, then our potential as a species might be far greater than we've imagined. The antediluvian world might not just be ancient history, it might be a glimpse of our own forgotten capabilities, waiting to be rediscovered and reclaimed. As sleep begins to claim your consciousness tonight, let your mind wander through the ruins of this lost world. Picture the last days of the antediluvian age, when the skies grew dark and the earth began to tremble, when the giants realized that their reign was ending and ordinary humans looked up in terror at waters falling from a sky that had never known rain. But also imagine the hope carried forward by 8 survivors on a wooden ark, preserving not just their lives but the memory of wonders that had been and the promise of wonders yet to come. In the silence that followed the flood, as the waters slowly receded and revealed a world scraped clean of its former glory, something extraordinary began to happen. The survivors didn't simply start over from nothing. They carried within their memories the blueprints of a lost civilization, and as they stepped onto dry ground, they began to rebuild, not from ignorance, but from the fragments of almost inconceivable knowledge. Imagine Noah's descendants gathering around evening fires, listening to their grandfather's stories of the world that was. Picture him describing cities that touched the sky, vessels that sailed through air as easily as water, and craftsmen who could shape metal with techniques that seemed like magic to post-flood eyes. These weren't fairy tales told to entertain children, they were technical manuals passed down through oral tradition, compressed into narrative form to survive the journey across the catastrophe. The evidence for this knowledge transfer appears in the most unexpected places. In ancient Mesopotamia, cuneiform tablets record mathematical calculations of stunning sophistication, logarithms, algebraic equations, astronomical predictions that wouldn't be rediscovered in the West for thousands of years. The Sumerians possessed detailed knowledge of planetary orbits, including planets that weren't officially discovered until the invention of modern telescopes. How did ancient scribes know about Uranus and Neptune when these distant worlds appear as nothing more than faint points of light, even to our most powerful instruments? The answer may lie in understanding that this knowledge didn't originate with the Sumerians at all. They were simply the first post-flood civilization, successful enough to develop writing systems capable of preserving what their ancestors had passed down through generations of careful memorization. The astronomical knowledge, the mathematical principles, the engineering techniques, all of it may have been antediluvian inheritance, slowly being reconstructed and recorded as human civilization rebuilt itself. Consider the mysterious precision of ancient architecture that appears across the globe with no apparent connection between the builders. The massive stones of Puma Punku in Bolivia, cut with tolerances that rival modern machining capabilities. The perfectly fitted blocks of the Great Pyramid, assembled with a precision that modern construction struggles to match. The underwater ruins at Dwarka in India, showing urban planning and hydraulic engineering that seems impossibly advanced for its supposed age. These aren't isolated anomalies. They're part of a pattern that becomes clear when we understand them as attempts to recreate antediluvian achievements. The builders weren't primitive peoples stumbling towards civilization. They were the inheritors of lost knowledge, working from half-remembered instructions to rebuild wonders they had never seen but somehow knew how to construct. The speed with which certain technologies appeared in the archaeological record supports this interpretation. Writing systems don't gradually evolve from simple pictures to complex abstract symbols. They appear suddenly, fully formed, as if someone already understood the principles of symbolic communication and was simply adapting them to available materials. The same pattern holds for metallurgy, astronomy, mathematics, and urban planning. But knowledge wasn't the only thing that survived the flood. The bloodlines of the antediluvian world, diluted but not entirely lost, continued to produce individuals whose capabilities seemed to transcend normal human limitations. Ancient texts speak of post-flood heroes and rulers whose strength, wisdom, and longevity echoed their antediluvian ancestors, though in diminished form. The biblical account tells us that Nimrod, a descendant of Noah through his son Ham, became a mighty hunter before the Lord and built the first great post-flood empire. His name literally means "we shall rebel," and ancient traditions describe him as a giant of extraordinary power who sought to restore the glory of the pre-flood world. Under his leadership, humanity began construction of the Tower of Babel, an attempt to build a structure that would reach into the heavens, perhaps trying to recreate the atmospheric manipulation technologies that had maintained the antediluvian climate. The Tower of Babel represents more than just human pride or defiance. It may have been humanity's first organized attempt to recover antediluvian technology on a massive scale. Ancient texts describe it not just as a tall building, but as a complex technological project involving astronomical observation, atmospheric manipulation, and communication systems. The tower wasn't meant simply to reach heaven. It was designed to restore the conditions that had made the pre-flood world possible. The divine intervention that scattered the builders and confused their languages wasn't just punishment for hubris. It was a deliberate prevention of technological recovery. By fragmenting human communication and scattering the population across the earth, the project was abandoned, and with it, humanity's best chance of quickly rebuilding antediluvian civilization. This scattering had profound consequences for the preservation and distribution of ancient knowledge. Different groups of survivors carried different fragments of the original wisdom, which explains why we find similar but not identical traditions scattered across the globe. The flood stories themselves show this pattern. Nearly identical core narratives with culture-specific variations that reflect the particular knowledge preserved by each group. In Egypt, the descendants of Ham developed sophisticated mummification techniques that may have been attempts to achieve the extreme longevity their ancestors had possessed naturally. The elaborate pyramid complexes weren't just tombs, they were technological projects designed to preserve and potentially resurrect their builders using principles derived from antediluvian life extension knowledge. In Mesopotamia, the descendants of Shem built ziggurats that served as more than temples. These massive structures functioned as astronomical observatories, using antediluvian knowledge of planetary movements to create calendars of extraordinary accuracy. The Sumerian pantheon of gods may actually represent memories of the Watchers and their hybrid offspring, transformed through generations of oral tradition from historical figures into mythological deities. In the Americas, isolated from Old World influence until relatively recent times, indigenous cultures developed technologies that seem to require knowledge of principles supposedly unknown until the modern era. The Nazca lines require aerial perspective to appreciate their full design. Ancient Peruvian textiles show mathematical patterns that wouldn't be formalized in European mathematics for centuries. Mesoamerican calendars track astronomical cycles with precision that rivals modern computational methods. These achievements make more sense when understood as applications of preserved antediluvian knowledge rather than independent discoveries by isolated populations. The knowledge was there, carried in human memory, and gradually being reconstructed, but the global communication network that had made the pre-flood world possible was gone, replaced by isolated pockets of civilization working from incomplete information. The process wasn't uniform or always successful. Some groups preserved certain aspects of the ancient knowledge while losing others entirely. Some developed impressive stoneworking techniques but lost the metallurgical knowledge. Others maintained astronomical precision but couldn't recreate the architectural achievements. The result was a mosaic of partial recoveries, each impressive in its own right, but none matching the integrated sophistication of the lost antediluvian civilization. Over time, even these partial recoveries began to fade. The knowledge was too complex to maintain without the supporting infrastructure that had originally developed it. Techniques were simplified, then lost entirely. Astronomical observations became ritualized without understanding. Mathematical principles devolved into numerological superstitions. The living knowledge of the antediluvian world slowly petrified into religious dogma and cultural tradition. But the most significant legacy of the antediluvian world wasn't technological, it was genetic. The hybrid bloodlines created by the union of Watchers and human women had been largely eliminated by the flood, but not entirely. Ancient texts consistently report the reappearance of giants in the post-flood world, particularly in the land of Canaan. These weren't new mutations, they were the resurgence of dormant genetic traits carried forward by survivors. The biblical account of the Israelite spies in Canaan provides vivid testimony to the survival of giant bloodlines. Numbers 13:33 records their report. There we saw the giants, the descendants of Enoch, who come from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. These weren't metaphorical descriptions, they were eyewitness accounts of beings whose physical dimensions defied normal human proportions. Archaeological evidence supports these ancient testimonies. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, numerous reports documented the discovery of human skeletal remains of extraordinary size. Newspapers across America regularly reported finds of skeletons measuring 8, 10, 12, and even 15 feet in height, often discovered in burial mounds alongside sophisticated artifacts that suggested these weren't primitive peoples, but members of advanced cultures. The Smithsonian Institution and other major museums reportedly collected many of these specimens, but they gradually disappeared from public display and scientific literature. Whether this represents deliberate suppression or simply the natural evolution of changing scientific paradigms remains debated, But the pattern is consistent physical evidence for post-flood giants was systematically removed from mainstream archaeological discourse. The genetic legacy extends beyond mere physical size. Ancient traditions describe the descendants of antediluvian bloodlines as possessing not just enhanced physicality, but expanded mental capabilities, extended lifespans, and unusual sensory abilities. These traits, diluted through generations of intermarriage with purely human lineages, might still persist in certain populations today. Modern genetic research has identified human populations with remarkable characteristics that seem to exceed normal human parameters. Some groups show exceptional resistance to diseases that devastate other populations. Others demonstrate cognitive abilities that appear to operate by different principles than standard human intelligence. Still others exhibit sensory capabilities, enhanced night vision, acute hearing, electromagnetic sensitivity that suggest their nervous systems function according to different specifications. Rather than viewing these as recent evolutionary adaptations, we might consider whether they represent the persistence of antediluvian genetic heritage. If the pre-flood world really did produce hybrid beings with capabilities beyond normal human limits, their genetic legacy might still be discoverable in human populations, whose ancestry traces back to the survivors and their immediate descendants. The implications extend far beyond academic curiosity. If antediluvian knowledge and capabilities are genuinely recoverable, if they represent not fantasy but forgotten human potential, then our species might be capable of achievements that dwarf our current technological civilization. The antediluvian world might not just be ancient history, it might be a preview of our own possible future. But such recovery comes with profound risks. The same knowledge that enabled antediluvian civilization to reach unprecedented heights also led to its destruction. The corruption that necessitated the flood wasn't accidental. It was the inevitable result of unlimited power in the hands of beings who had transcended normal human moral constraints. As we stand at the threshold of our own technological transcendence, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, space colonization, the lessons of the antediluvian world become urgently relevant. We're not the first civilization to achieve godlike capabilities. We're not the first to manipulate the fundamental forces of life and matter. And we won't be the first to face the choice between wisdom and power, between preservation and transformation, between remaining human and becoming something else entirely. The story of the antediluvian world is ultimately our own story, told in advance. It's a warning encoded in myth and legend, preserved through catastrophe and cultural transformation, waiting for the moment when humanity would once again stand where our ancestors stood at the crossroads between transcendence and annihilation. As sleep carries you deeper into dreams tonight, let your unconscious mind explore the implications of this ancient mystery. What if the capabilities we're developing aren't new at all, but recoveries of what we once possessed and lost? What if the future we're building is actually the past we're remembering? And what if the choices facing our civilization today are the same choices that determined the fate of the world before the flood? The antediluvian age ended in water and judgment, but its story continues in us, in our genes, our dreams, our relentless drive to transcend the limitations of ordinary human existence. Whether we repeat their mistakes or learn from their example may determine not just our own fate, but the fate of whatever world emerges from the choices we make in the years ahead. The mystery deepens when we examine how certain bloodlines seem to carry forward not just physical traits, but knowledge itself, as if information could be encoded in DNA like a biological library waiting to be accessed by future generations. This wasn't simply learned knowledge passed down through teaching, but something far more profound. Inherited wisdom that manifested as inexplicable intuitive understanding of complex principles. Ancient genealogies speak of certain family lines that consistently produced individuals with extraordinary capabilities, not just the obvious physical traits of size and strength, but mental faculties that seemed to operate by entirely different rules. These weren't simply intelligent people, they were beings who appeared to understand the fundamental workings of reality in ways that allowed them to manipulate matter, energy, and even time itself with techniques that looked like magic to ordinary observers. The Egyptian pharaohs claimed divine bloodlines that granted them knowledge of the afterlife and the ability to navigate between worlds. The Mesopotamian priest-kings possessed astronomical knowledge that allowed them to predict celestial events with impossible accuracy. The early Chinese emperors spoke of receiving the mandate of heaven, not just political authority, but actual technical knowledge transmitted through bloodline inheritance from ancestors who had walked with the gods themselves. These weren't isolated claims from a single culture, but consistent patterns appearing independently across civilizations that had no contact with each other. The implication is staggering. What if genetic inheritance in the antediluvian world included not just physical characteristics, but actual information content? What if the hybrid offspring of the Watchers didn't just possess enhanced bodies, but enhanced minds capable of storing and accessing vast databases of knowledge encoded at the molecular level? Modern science is only beginning to understand how information can be stored in biological systems. We've discovered that DNA can function as an incredibly dense data storage medium, capable of holding vast amounts of information in microscopic space. Researchers have successfully encoded everything from music to literature to computer programs in synthetic DNA, proving that genetic material can serve as a biological hard drive. But what if this capability isn't new? What if the antediluvian hybrids possessed biological information, storage systems that allowed them to carry forward the accumulated knowledge of their celestial parents? This would explain how post-flood civilizations could suddenly develop sophisticated technologies. Seemingly overnight, they weren't inventing these techniques from scratch, but accessing inherited memory banks activated by specific genetic triggers. The process wouldn't have been conscious or voluntary. Individuals carrying these genetic memories might have experienced sudden insights, vivid dreams, or intuitive understanding of complex principles without knowing where the knowledge originated. They might have found themselves capable of solving engineering problems, predicting natural phenomena, or understanding mathematical relationships that their conscious minds had never studied. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Throughout history, we find examples of individuals who seem to possess knowledge far beyond what their cultural context should have allowed. Ancient metallurgists who understood alloy compositions that modern science struggles to reverse engineer. Architects who built structures requiring mathematical principles supposedly undiscovered for centuries. Astronomers who tracked celestial cycles with precision that required computational capabilities their civilizations didn't officially possess. These anomalous individuals often appeared in family lines that claimed descent from divine or semi-divine ancestors. They weren't scattered randomly throughout the population, but clustered in specific bloodlines that maintained their unusual capabilities across multiple generations. The knowledge wasn't learned, it was inherited, activated by genetic switches that triggered access to information encoded in their DNA by antediluvian ancestors. The decline of these capabilities over time also makes sense within this framework. As the hybrid bloodlines became increasingly diluted through intermarriage with purely human populations, the genetic information systems would have become corrupted or inactive. The biological hard drives would still be present, but the access codes would be lost, leaving the knowledge locked away in genetic sequences that no longer functioned properly. This corruption process wouldn't have been uniform. Different bloodlines might have preserved different aspects of the original information systems. Some families might have retained the genetic codes for astronomical knowledge while losing the sequences for metallurgy. Others might have maintained the biological programming for architecture while losing access to mathematical databases. The result would be exactly what we see in the historical record: scattered pockets of inexplicable knowledge appearing in different cultures at different times. The implications extend far beyond ancient history. If these genetic information systems really existed, if DNA can truly function as a biological library for storing complex knowledge, then some of that information might still be recoverable. Modern genetic research has identified vast stretches of human DNA that appear to serve no current biological function, so-called junk DNA, that makes up over 90% of the human genome. What if this supposedly useless genetic material isn't junk at all, but deactivated information storage systems inherited from antediluvian ancestors? What if the techniques being developed for genetic engineering and DNA manipulation could potentially reactivate these ancient biological databases, giving us access to knowledge that predates recorded history? The possibility is both thrilling and terrifying. Thrilling because it suggests that the solutions to our greatest challenges might already exist, encoded in our own genetic material, waiting to be unlocked. Terrifying because the same knowledge that enabled antediluvian civilization to achieve godlike capabilities also led to the corruption and violence that necessitated its destruction. But the genetic legacy of the antediluvian world encompasses more than just stored information. The physical capabilities of the hybrid bloodlines represented genuine enhancements to human biology that might still be recoverable through modern genetic techniques. Enhanced strength, accelerated healing, extended lifespans, expanded sensory capabilities. All of these traits might be dormant rather than extinct, waiting for the right genetic triggers to reactivate them. Contemporary research into human genetic variation has identified populations with remarkable characteristics that seem to exceed normal human parameters. Some groups show resistance to diseases that are universally fatal to other populations. Others demonstrate physical capabilities, bone density, muscle fiber composition, cardiovascular efficiency, that operate by different biological rules than standard human physiology. Most intriguingly, certain individuals exhibit sensory and cognitive abilities that suggest their nervous systems function according to enhanced specifications. Enhanced night vision that allows them to see in conditions of near-total darkness. Electromagnetic sensitivity that enables them to detect electrical fields and navigate by sensing magnetic variations. Cognitive processing capabilities that allow them to perform mathematical calculations, memorize vast amounts of information, or recognize complex patterns with speed and accuracy that defies normal human limitations. Rather than viewing these as recent evolutionary adaptations or statistical outliers, we might consider whether they represent the partial expression of genetic enhancements inherited from antediluvian bloodlines. The full capabilities of the original hybrids might be dormant in human DNA, expressing themselves occasionally in diluted form when the right genetic combinations align. The process of genetic reactivation might not require advanced technology. Throughout history, certain bloodlines have maintained practices, dietary regimens, breathing techniques, physical exercises, meditation disciplines that they claim unlock hidden human potential. These traditions often trace their origins to antediluvian sources, passed down through generations of initiates who understood that human capabilities extend far beyond what modern civilization considers normal. What if these practices aren't superstitious rituals, but sophisticated biotechnology disguised as spiritual discipline? What if the yoga systems of India, the martial arts of China, the mystery schools of Egypt, and the shamanic traditions of the Americas all represent fragments of antediluvian genetic activation protocols, preserved in cultural form when the biological understanding was lost? Modern biohacking communities are inadvertently rediscovering some of these principles. Practitioners report achieving enhanced physical performance, accelerated healing, expanded sensory awareness, and altered states of consciousness through techniques that combine ancient practices with modern scientific understanding. They're not just improving normal human capabilities, they're accessing capabilities that seem to transcend normal human limitations entirely. The convergence is remarkable. Ancient traditions describing superhuman abilities achieved through specific practices. Modern genetic research revealing dormant potential in human DNA. Contemporary biohackers discovering techniques that seem to activate capabilities beyond normal human parameters. All three streams point toward the same conclusion. Human beings possess latent potential that far exceeds what we consider normal, and this potential might be the inherited legacy of antediluvian genetic engineering. But accessing this potential comes with profound risks that the antediluvian world learned too late. Enhanced capabilities without enhanced wisdom lead to corruption and violence. Transcendent power, in the hands of beings who have abandoned moral constraints, becomes a force for destruction rather than creation. The flood wasn't just a natural disaster, it was divine intervention to prevent enhanced humans from destroying not just themselves, but the fundamental fabric of reality itself. The same choices that faced the antediluvian world now face our own civilization. We stand at the threshold of genetic enhancement technologies that could unlock human capabilities beyond anything in recorded history. We're developing techniques for manipulating DNA, extending lifespans, enhancing physical and cognitive performance, and even transferring consciousness between biological and artificial substrates. These capabilities mirror what the Watchers offered to antediluvian humanity: transcendence beyond normal human limitations, access to knowledge and power that could reshape reality itself. The question isn't whether we can achieve these enhancements, but whether we should, and whether we can avoid repeating the mistakes that led to the destruction of the world before the flood. The antediluvian bloodlines carried forward more than just genetic information and enhanced capabilities. They preserved something far more dangerous: the memory of what it felt like to be gods. This psychological inheritance might be the most significant legacy of the pre-flood world, not the knowledge or the abilities, but the mindset that views normal human limitations as obstacles to be overcome rather than boundaries to be respected. Throughout history, individuals claiming descent from divine bloodlines have consistently exhibited a particular psychological profile. They demonstrate exceptional ambition, remarkable confidence in their own capabilities, and an apparent inability to accept that anything should be beyond their reach. They're not content with human limitations, they're compelled to transcend them, regardless of the consequences for themselves or others. This drive toward transcendence isn't necessarily evil, but it's inherently dangerous. It's the same impulse that leads to genuine breakthrough discoveries and revolutionary advances in human capability. But it's also the impulse that leads to hubris, corruption, and the kind of overreach that brings down civilizations. The line between beneficial enhancement and destructive transcendence is often invisible until it's already been crossed. The antediluvian world crossed that line and paid the ultimate price. Their story serves as both promise and warning for our own civilization as we approach similar crossroads. We have the capability to enhance ourselves beyond normal human limitations. We have access to knowledge and power that previous generations could only dream of. And we have the same choice that faced our antediluvian ancestors, whether to use these gifts wisely or to let them consume us in the pursuit of godhood. As consciousness fades into the realm of dreams tonight, let your sleeping mind wrestle with these profound questions. What does it mean to be human when humanity itself becomes malleable? How do we distinguish between beneficial enhancement and dangerous corruption? And what wisdom can we learn from the civilization that achieved everything we're striving for, only to lose it all beneath the waters of divine judgment? The antediluvian world lives on not just in ancient texts and archaeological mysteries, but in our DNA, our dreams, and our relentless drive to become more than what we are. Whether their legacy becomes our salvation or our destruction depends on the choices we make as we stand where they once stood, at the crossroads between transcendence and annihilation. The echoes of that lost world whisper to us still, carrying warnings encoded in myth and memory, waiting for the wisdom to hear them before it's too late. Sleep well, and dream of the world that was, the world that is, and the world that yet might be, if we can learn from the flood that ended one age and choose more wisely as we enter the next. The whispers of that lost world grow stronger as our own civilization approaches capabilities that mirror their achievements. In laboratories around the globe, scientists are unlocking genetic codes that could extend human lifespans far beyond their current limits. In research facilities hidden from public view, experiments push the boundaries of human enhancement, seeking to augment our physical and mental capabilities in ways that would have seemed like magic to previous generations. But these aren't entirely new discoveries. They're rediscoveries, fragments of understanding that once flowed freely in the antediluvian world, now being painstakingly reconstructed by minds that have forgotten their source. The techniques we're developing to manipulate DNA, to enhance human performance, to extend consciousness beyond the boundaries of individual mortality, all of these echo technologies that may have been commonplace before the flood. The pharmaceutical industry pursues compounds that could halt or reverse aging, not realizing they may be attempting to recreate the natural longevity that antediluvian humans possessed without artificial intervention. Genetic researchers work to eliminate hereditary diseases, unknowingly trying to restore the genetic integrity that was corrupted when divine and human bloodlines first intermingled. Neuroscientists explore consciousness transfer and artificial intelligence, perhaps unconsciously seeking to recreate the expanded awareness that the Watchers shared with their human students. Each breakthrough brings us closer to capabilities our ancestors took for granted. Each advancement carries us further along a path that has been traveled before, though we walk it blind to its destination. We celebrate our progress toward transcendence, unaware that we're following in the footsteps of beings who achieved everything we're striving for, only to watch it all disappear beneath the rising waters of divine judgment. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. As our technology advances, our moral frameworks struggle to keep pace. We develop capabilities to reshape life itself while debating whether we should. We create artificial intelligences that may soon surpass human intelligence while arguing about whether consciousness can truly emerge from silicon and software. We manipulate genetic codes that took millions of years to evolve while wondering whether we're improving humanity or destroying what makes us human in the first place. These are the same debates that must have raged in the courts and councils of the antediluvian world. The same questions that the hybrid offspring of Watchers and humans grappled with as their capabilities expanded beyond all previous boundaries. The same moral crossroads where one choice leads to wisdom and another to corruption, but both paths look remarkably similar until you're too far along to turn back. The survivors of that world tried to warn us. They embedded their warnings in every story they told, every tradition they preserved, every religious system they established in the aftermath of the flood. The Tower of Babel isn't just a story about linguistic confusion, it's a warning about the dangers of technological hubris. The myths of fallen angels aren't just religious allegory, they're historical accounts of what happens when knowledge is shared without wisdom, when power is granted without moral constraint. But warnings encoded in myth are easily dismissed as primitive superstition by civilizations convinced of their own sophistication. We read these ancient accounts as quaint folklore rather than urgent messages from people who witnessed the consequences of unlimited enhancement firsthand. We study them as cultural artifacts rather than technical manuals written by the survivors of a technological catastrophe that dwarfs anything in recorded history. The irony is profound. The very capabilities that allow us to dismiss these ancient warnings as unscientific are the same capabilities that are leading us toward the same precipice where the antediluvian world stood before its destruction. Our scientific understanding gives us the tools to enhance ourselves beyond human limitations, but it also blinds us to the possibility that others have walked this path before and found it leads to annihilation. Yet, perhaps this repetition isn't accidental. Perhaps consciousness itself follows cycles of expansion and contraction, reaching toward transcendence only to pull back when the cost becomes clear. Perhaps the flood wasn't an ending but a reset, clearing the stage for the next act in an ongoing drama of human potential and its consequences. If this interpretation is correct, then our current technological development isn't random progress, but the inevitable unfolding of patterns encoded in consciousness itself. We're not just building toward our own transcendence, we're rebuilding toward the same transcendence that previous iterations of human civilization achieved and lost. The knowledge we're recovering, the capabilities we're developing, the choices we're facing, all of it may be as predetermined as the rising of the sun. But predetermination doesn't eliminate choice. Even if we're following an ancient pattern, we can still choose how the pattern resolves. The antediluvian world chose corruption over wisdom, power over responsibility, transcendence over humanity itself. Their choice led to destruction so complete that only 8 people survived to carry their story forward. We can choose differently. The key may lie in understanding what made those 8 survivors different from the billions who perished. They weren't chosen for their genetic purity alone, though that played a role. They weren't selected for their technological knowledge, though they carried forward fragments of antediluvian wisdom. They were preserved because they retained something that the rest of their civilization had lost the capacity to choose: restraint over expansion, preservation over transformation, humanity over transcendence. Noah and his family represented the last remnant of humans who understood that some boundaries shouldn't be crossed, some knowledge shouldn't be pursued, some enhancements shouldn't be attempted. They carried forward not just the genetic and intellectual heritage of the antediluvian world, but its moral memory, the understanding of what happens when beings with godlike capabilities abandon the constraints that keep them human. This moral dimension may be the most crucial aspect of the antediluvian legacy. The knowledge can be recovered, the genetic enhancements can be reactivated, the technologies can be rebuilt. But unless we also recover the wisdom to use these capabilities responsibly, we'll simply repeat the cycle of rise and fall that has played out before. The question isn't whether we can achieve transcendence. We almost certainly can, given enough time and resources. The question is whether we can achieve transcendence without losing ourselves in the process, whether we can become more than human while remaining fundamentally human at our core. The antediluvian world failed this test. Their enhanced capabilities led them to view ordinary humans as inferior beings to be dominated rather than fellow creatures to be protected. Their extended lifespans gave them time to develop sophisticated philosophies of exploitation rather than compassion. Their divine knowledge convinced them they were above the moral laws that governed lesser beings. The result was a civilization of extraordinary capability and equally extraordinary corruption. A world where the strong preyed upon the weak without restraint, where knowledge was used as a weapon rather than a gift, where the pursuit of power became an end in itself rather than a means to beneficial ends. That world drowned beneath waters that fell from a sky that had never known rain, buried beneath sediments that preserved its memory while erasing its presence. But its legacy lives on in us, in our genetic inheritance, our technological capabilities, our moral choices, and our fundamental nature as beings caught between earth and heaven, humanity and divinity, wisdom and transcendence. As you drift deeper into sleep, let your unconscious mind explore the implications of this inheritance. We are the children of survivors, carrying forward both the promise and the peril of the antediluvian world. We possess fragments of their knowledge, echoes of their capabilities, and access to the same transcendent potential that elevated them beyond normal human limitations. But we also carry their moral burden. We face the same choices that determined their fate. We stand at the same crossroads where one path leads to wisdom and preservation, while another leads to corruption and destruction. The difference between these paths may be invisible until we're too far along either one to change course. The antediluvian age ended in water and judgment, but its story continues in us. Whether that story concludes with the restoration of paradise or the repetition of catastrophe depends on the choices we make as inheritors of both their promise and their warning. The flood that ended their world may have been a conclusion, but it was also a beginning, the first chapter in our own story of enhancement and transcendence, wisdom and folly, salvation and destruction. Sleep well and dream of the choice that awaits us all: to learn from the flood or to drown beneath waters of our own making. The antediluvian world achieved everything we're reaching for and lost everything they had achieved. Their legacy whispers to us across the centuries, carrying both the blueprint for transcendence and the warning of its price. In the end, perhaps that's the greatest gift the survivors of the flood gave to future generations, not just the preservation of life and knowledge, but the preservation of choice itself. The choice to repeat their ancestors' mistakes or to find a wiser path forward. The choice to pursue transcendence with humility rather than hubris. The choice to become gods without forgetting we were once human. The story of the antediluvian world isn't finished. It lives on in every laboratory where scientists push the boundaries of human enhancement. It continues in every breakthrough that brings us closer to godlike capabilities. It unfolds in every choice we make about how to use the power we're gaining. And in the quiet hours of the night, when consciousness fades and dreams take hold, the ancient world reaches across the centuries to touch our sleeping minds. In those dreams, we remember what we once were, glimpse what we might become, and perhaps, if we're wise enough to listen, learn what we must choose to remain truly human in a world where humanity itself has become negotiable. The flood is over, the ark has landed, the survivors have disembarked, but the story of transcendence and its consequences continues, written now in our choices rather than their fate. Sleep and dream of the world that was, the world that is, and the world that yet might be if we prove worthy of the legacy entrusted to us by 8 souls who carried the memory of paradise lost through the waters of judgment into the hope of redemption. The antediluvian bloodlines didn't simply fade into history, they transformed, adapted, and found new ways to preserve their extraordinary inheritance in a world that had forgotten their origins. In the centuries following the Great Deluge, these genetic echoes began to manifest in ways both subtle and profound, creating individuals whose capabilities seemed to bridge the gap between the world that was and the world that would be. Picture, if you can, the first generation born after the waters receded. Children who carried within their cells the compressed memories of 1,000 years of accumulated wisdom, yet grew up in a world that had been scrubbed clean of all physical evidence of that knowledge. These weren't ordinary children learning from primitive beginnings. They were the inheritors of cosmic understanding, forced to rediscover technologies their very DNA remembered, but their conscious minds had never seen. The psychological impact of this genetic inheritance cannot be overstated. Imagine possessing an intuitive understanding of mathematical principles that wouldn't be formally discovered for thousands of years, yet having no context for where that knowledge originated. Picture finding yourself capable of architectural insights that seem to come from nowhere, or astronomical observations that your culture insists should be impossible. These individuals often became the founders of mystery schools, the architects of impossible monuments, the priest-kings who claimed divine inspiration for knowledge that felt both foreign and familiar. They weren't charlatans or primitive mystics. They were beings struggling to understand capabilities that exceeded their cultural framework's ability to explain. The ancient world's obsession with bloodlines and genealogies takes on new meaning when viewed through this lens. These weren't simply social hierarchies based on political power or accumulated wealth. They were careful records of genetic inheritance, tracking which family lines retained the strongest connections to antediluvian capabilities and knowledge. Egyptian pharaohs who claimed divine descent weren't engaging in political theater. They were acknowledging a biological reality that granted them access to architectural, astronomical, and mathematical knowledge that seemed to flow from their very cells. The elaborate mummification processes weren't just about preserving the body for an afterlife. They were attempts to maintain the genetic integrity of bloodlines that carried irreplaceable information in their DNA. Mesopotamian priest-kings who spoke directly with gods weren't describing supernatural encounters. They were accessing genetic memories that felt like external communication because the knowledge didn't originate from their conscious learning. The ziggurats they built weren't just temples. They were technological projects designed using principles encoded in their inherited memory systems. The phenomenon wasn't limited to the Near East. Across the globe, in cultures that had no contact with each other, similar patterns emerged. Chinese emperors who received the mandate of heaven described receiving technical knowledge through dreams and visions. Mayan astronomer priests tracked celestial cycles with impossible precision, using techniques that seemed to download directly into their consciousness. Celtic druids preserved vast databases of information through purely oral tradition, as if their minds were accessing biological libraries that didn't require written records. These weren't coincidences or independent discoveries. They were manifestations of the same genetic inheritance expressing itself in different cultural contexts, adapting to available materials and social structures, while maintaining core principles that transcended any single civilization's understanding. The knowledge wasn't randomly distributed. Certain bloodlines consistently produced individuals with specific types of enhanced capabilities. Some families generated architects who could design structures requiring mathematical precision that their cultures hadn't formally developed. Others produced astronomers who tracked planetary movements with accuracy that required computational capabilities their societies didn't officially possess. Most intriguingly, these capabilities often appeared to be linked to specific genetic markers that could be traced through family trees across multiple generations. The knowledge wasn't learned, it was inherited, passed down through biological mechanisms that modern science is only beginning to understand. But the inheritance came with a price. The same genetic factors that enabled access to antediluvian knowledge also carried the psychological patterns that had led to the original civilization's destruction. Enhanced capabilities bred enhanced ambition. Access to transcendent knowledge fostered a transcendent ego. The conviction that one possessed divine inheritance naturally led to the belief that normal human limitations shouldn't apply. Throughout history, individuals claiming descent from divine bloodlines have exhibited remarkably consistent psychological profiles, extraordinary confidence in their own capabilities, apparent immunity to normal human moral constraints, an almost compulsive drive to transcend whatever limitations their current circumstances imposed. They weren't content with human achievements, they were compelled to surpass them. This psychological inheritance may be more dangerous than the genetic enhancements themselves. Physical capabilities can be regulated, knowledge can be controlled, but the mindset that views transcendence as a birthright and limitation as an insult is far more difficult to contain. It drives individuals to push beyond boundaries that exist for good reasons, to pursue capabilities that come with consequences they're not equipped to handle. The antediluvian genetic inheritance didn't just preserve knowledge and abilities, it preserved the hubris that had originally corrupted them. Each generation that accessed these capabilities faced the same fundamental choice that had confronted their ancestors: whether to use transcendent power responsibly or to let it consume them in the pursuit of godhood. Some chose wisely. They used their inherited knowledge to benefit humanity, building structures that would endure for millennia, developing agricultural techniques that could feed growing populations, creating artistic and cultural achievements that still inspire wonder today. They recognized that their capabilities were gifts to be stewarded rather than rights. They used their genetic inheritance to dominate rather to be exploited. Others chose poorly than serve, to exploit rather than enlighten, to transcend humanity rather than elevate it. Their stories are preserved in myths and legends, as cautionary tales beings who achieved godlike power only to discover that power without wisdom leads inevitably to corruption and destruction. The pattern repeated across cultures and centuries because it was encoded in the genetic inheritance itself. The same DNA sequences that granted access to transcendent capabilities also carried the psychological predispositions that made their misuse almost inevitable. Enhanced humans weren't just physically and mentally superior, they were psychologically programmed to believe in their own superiority. This creates a profound paradox for our own civilization as we develop technologies that could theoretically restore antediluvian capabilities. The knowledge we're recovering isn't morally neutral. It comes packaged with psychological patterns that encourage its misuse. The genetic enhancements we're pursuing don't just improve human performance, they alter human nature in ways that make corruption more likely rather than less. And so, as dawn approaches and the last whispers of dreams fade into memory, we find ourselves standing where Noah once stood at the threshold between what was and what might yet be. The antediluvian world calls to us across the centuries, not as ancient history, but as prophecy, its echoes growing stronger with each breakthrough in our laboratories, each enhancement we unlock in our genes, each boundary we cross in our relentless march toward transcendence. Their story is our story, written in advance by those who walked this path before us and paid its ultimate price. The choice they faced, wisdom or corruption, service or domination, humanity or godhood, awaits us still. Will we learn from the flood that ended their age, or will we drown beneath waters of our own making? Sleep well, and when you wake, remember, we are the inheritors of paradise lost, but also of the choice to find it once again.